Hey Joshua, I've been thinking. Maybe I should start playing the victim all the time.
Wait, what?
So, as you could probably tell, that first bit was just a joke. Just a joke. Introducing the topic today about not complaining or giving up. Um, so, if you've watched the show or listened before, I'm Zach Griffin, and with me is Joshua Hester. Um, he's co hosting with me this season. How are you, man?
Doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm very excited for this topic because I think this topic applies to a lot of people, including myself at times. So I'm very excited for the topic today.
Yeah, it's interesting because we kind of live in a culture of complaining and playing the victim, and yeah, it's kind of, we may not like to use the words or may not fess up to saying that we're the victim. I'm a victim. I'm being impressed.
Yeah.
But you might say, like, you might just complain all the time, and it may not have anything to do with politics or culture. It may just have to do with your circumstances and your situation. Um, you know, Last Sunday I gave a lesson on worry and what worry does. What does worry actually do? Um, and in Matthew chapter 6, we learn that worry does nothing.
Hmm.
There's no fruit from it. So similarly, um, I want to ask the question: what about complaining? Um, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. What does complaining about our circumstances actually do?
Well, it's funny because when I take a group of kids on a trip, I essentially have two rules. Number one, be flexible. Okay, like this trip is not going to
Yeah,
go as planned. And number two, no complaining. Like that's my two rules: be
there you go.
flexible
Two
and no
rules.
complaining. Yeah, because complaining does nothing, or at least in my experience, complaining does nothing except make me want to strangle a kid at times. Now,
Yeah,
complaining does no good, and but it's easy for me to say that though. It's easy for me to say, complaining does no good when I have moments in my life where I definitely do some complaining, unfortunately, whether it's to my wife or to my friends, people that I know. Um, I can sometimes have a pretty good pity party for myself, but in the end,
yeah. I think we
in
all
the end,
we all have the temptation to give in to complaining every now and then. I feel like this is one of the things. Like, I'm generally a positive person, and I try to. I know what complaining can actually do, because I think that it's not that it does nothing, because there are things that complaining does do. It weighs down your heart, right? It makes you sink. It makes your attitude change, and since I know that that's what happens with me, generally I try to think positively about things. I try to think about, well, maybe God has a different plan, or maybe I think about, um, things aren't as bad as they seem, or look at the blessings of the circumstances versus uh, the challenges. But anyway, we're gonna break this up into really two parts today, and the way that I'd like for us to consider complaining um, today is to introduce a principle. And I didn't get this from anywhere. I just read the passage and was like, we should have a principle based on this passage. Um, but it's to help combat our propensity to self-victimize. To say, my circumstances are poor and I can't do anything about it, and therefore I'm just gonna wallow. I'm gonna complain. Um, and I'm going to call this the John 9:3 principle. So let's turn in our Bibles if you'd like to follow along with us. And what translation you using, Joshua?
I'm using the English Standard today.
Okay, cool. I think in previous seasons that was my go-to. Logan would do the Christian Standard Bible,
Hmm.
but I've switched over recently to New American Standard.
Okay.
So, but I want to get your reading from the ESV there on John 9:1 through 3,
Just verse 3,
verses 1 through 3.
1 through 3. Got it.
Yes.
As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him.
Okay, so this is this is an interesting situation Jesus finds himself in. Uh, there's a guy, and he was born blind, so he's never seen in his entire life. Um, and there's this idea that, and it was even prevalent during Job's time, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea that, if something bad is happening to you, it's because of sin, right? What did Job's friends say to him, about his circumstances?
Yeah,
You
they
don't
asked.
have,
I mean, they asked
yeah,
him, what did you do? What happened to deserve
yeah,
this? Yeah,
right. It's like you need to repent of whatever this sin is. You need to turn around and stop with your wickedness. Job is like, what wickedness? What have I done? I
yeah.
didn't deserve this. I mean, but he talks about it in that way, and so in their minds they're thinking, well, this is somebody's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're thinking if he's born blind, this is somebody's fault. And so the disciples ask him, Jesus' disciples ask him, Rabbi, teacher, whose fault is this? Is it
Mm-hmm.
his own sin or the sin of his parents? So they're sort of playing this sort of blame game. Um, but Jesus explains that it's not anybody's fault, right? It's not anybody, this is not something that, is a just punishment for sin. Um, but these are circumstances that are unfavorable. He recognizes that. Um, but what purpose do those circumstances serve? And that's where we kind of can apply a principle. So, what do you see? What do you see in the text that Jesus says is the purpose of that?
Uh, well, he says, number one, it was not that this man sinned, or it wasn't his parents. He clears that up first. And the ESV says, but that the works of God might be displayed in him.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me in this story is we don't know we don't know how old this man is. I mean, he could have been 18 years old. I mean, he could have been 48 years old. I mean, we don't know. Um, but something that's interesting is that for years, this man has been blind for the purpose of, what does he say? That the works of God might be displayed in him.
Yeah. So that the works of God might be displayed in him. Um, there is a blessing that's planned in the circumstances that this man is in. And we may find ourselves in less than favorable circumstances, but those circumstances can be used as an opportunity for God to work. Right? Sometimes it's not like this. Like this individual where there's a particular healing that takes place. But I want to talk about some examples in Scripture, and I'd like for you to chime in and mention any that you think of. But one individual that I was thinking of right away is Paul. Paul, I think it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he talks about the thorn in the flesh. And there's this weakness, right? And there's this thing that is an unfavorable circumstance, and God doesn't get rid of the circumstance, but he uses it for his own glory. He shows that in Paul's weakness, that's where God provides the most strength. And so Paul would say at that time, I'm gonna boast, right? And we're gonna bring up the passage a little bit later, and we're gonna read from it. So with Paul, he was in an unfavorable circumstance, and God used him in those circumstances to accomplish work. Another one, and I'll let you chime in. I've got several listed on our outline, but you can take one of those, or you can mention one yourself. Another one that I think of is David. When he was just a young shepherd boy, he was already anointed to be king. And what's great about that is, he's anointed to be king after Saul, and then what happens? He goes back to being a shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
Like he doesn't like do anything special. He's like, all right, well, you're anointed to be the next king of Israel. Go back and tend to the sheep like you were. It's like his life doesn't change at all.
Right.
But then he goes, to see his father sends him to go and give the brothers some food at the front lines with the Philistines. And David, what kind of person is David at this point? He's a young guy. I mean, I don't know. Do you know about how old he was? I'm not sure. The text doesn't really reveal.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm thinking he would be, in my mind, a child.
He's a youth. We know that at least.
In his teenage years somewhere.
Youths.
Yeah, in his teenage years somewhere. Whether that's closer to 12 or closer to 17, I don't know, but somewhere in there, I would think.
Right, and then so he gets put in this situation where it's like, well, none of these men are doing, they don't have faith to challenge Goliath, but I do, because I know the God that we serve, right? So God used him, even though he's a young kid. That might be seen as a weakness, and certainly in that time it was a weakness. In our time, it's seen as a weakness, like you're a little kid. What say do you have in church affairs, or what say do you have in pretty much anything? But God used him in his circumstance. He could have played the victim and said, "Well, I'm just a kid. I can't do anything about it," and made excuses and complained. But that's not what happened.
Well, I think of someone who actually did make excuses, which was Moses. At the burning bush, you have this scene where God's like, okay, I've heard the groanings of my people, and you're going to be the one to deliver them out of Pharaoh's hand. And Moses is like, actually, hold up, God. I don't think I'm the man, and then he gives all of these excuses. I'm not a good orator. I can't talk well. And there's a moment in the scripture where, Moses is going through all of these excuses and is complaining about that God has asked him to do this. And it says that God is angry with Moses. And he says, fine, I'll send Aaron with you, and he can do the talking for you. So Moses was actually, I think about complaining to my parents or complaining to whoever we complain to. I can't imagine complaining to God. Hey, you're going to ask me to do this, but I'm just going to complain about it to you, God. I don't want to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. So Moses, he was kind of like, who am I, to do this? And another individual that was like that was Gideon. He said, who am I? And it's amazing. I love the scene so much. and it just is set up so well in Scripture. Where is Gideon when the Lord first approaches him? He's hiding in a hole, right? He's hiding in a hole. He is threshing out wheat in a winepress, which, a threshing floor was a big open space. It's like out, and they would, crush the grain, and they would pick it up, and the chaff would like blow in the wind, and that's how it would separate it. But he's in a hole in the ground trying to do this. So there's no air circulation. He's having to like pick through the stuff. And then this angel comes, like this messenger from God comes and says, "You mighty man of valor," right? It's like, what? And then so he has excuses, and he says, I'm the least of my father's house, and our clan is the least in all of Israel, and who am I to do this? He's cowering because of Midian, hiding in a hole, and at first, it seems like he's sort of making excuses and complaining and all, but regardless of the circumstances he was in, God used him to lead, right? To lead against Midian and to conquer over them with 300 men. So you've got all of these circumstances, and we can focus on physical things too. We can focus on the the shortcomings or the the circumstances that people in were in physical ways, like the blind man, or we could think about whatever Paul's thorn in the flesh was, or we see him write these closers of his letters, and it makes you think God's using this guy, and he has he's just, I don't know. There's times where he talks about being sick, and there's times where he talks about see how I'm writing with my own hand such large letters here, and it's like, why not pick somebody that just can do it all by themselves, right? But that's not what God does. He picks people like David, and he picks people like Moses, and he uses the circumstances that people are in where they could bellyache and they could complain, but God uses them regardless of their circumstances. And we don't have to go through every one of these, but I like to think about Jesus' disciples too.
Mm-hmm.
Who were these men, right? These men are just about as different can be. I like that Jesus, in his group of his close group of disciples, he has a tax collector and a zealot. I love that you have one that's pretty much seen as a traitor for serving Rome and being a tax collector and being a cheat. That's kind of the reputation. And then you have the zealots that are like, we will take the sword against Rome,
yes.
and we're gonna
yes.
like they're opposite ends on the political spectrum, and Jesus unifies them in such a way, regardless of their circumstances, God was able to use them, and the works of God are done through them. And every one of these people that we've talked about, the works of God were seen and done. It's just incredible.
Yeah, I've always wondered the fact that there was such a diverse group within, the disciples of Jesus, and even the 12, like the 12 closest ones. I wonder how much time, he spent. I don't know. You said Jesus unified them. I wonder how much time it took for him to unify them and to listen to their complaining about each other, or I can imagine, Peter saying to Andrew when Matthew becomes part of the 12, like, can you believe Jesus? Can you believe he picked a tax collector to be part of us, to be part of this group, Like, what's he thinking? What's he doing? Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't watched the show The Chosen. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Well, I've seen the clip though when Matthew gets called to be a disciple, and they're all kind of like, "What are you doing? Why are you talking to him?"
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like he's a tax collector, and every one of them is like. But I could especially see somebody like Simon, or like Andrew, or any of them really. But I think particularly about Simon because he was Simon the Zealot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think about those individuals and like they could be they're as different as different can be, and yet these were the individuals that carried the gospel to the world, to begin with, um, in unity, sharing that message for all men. I mean, it's incredible. Um, um, so yeah, can you think of any other examples, or is anything else come to mind?
I mean, I think about going back to Moses. I think it's interesting how Moses had his excuses and even complaints against God, and then they go through the 10 plagues, and then they're leaving Egypt, and all of a sudden, Pharaoh's men are coming, and Moses, who was once the complainer, is now surrounded by people that are complaining to him about. They're saying, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Why did you have to
Yeah,
bring us out here? Um,
right.
so I don't know. It's interesting to me how I've always wondered in that moment if Moses was like, so this is what it sounds like to complain and to give excuses.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and we're going to jump into some of the application of this in just a second. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for watching or listening today. We want to remind you to like, subscribe, follow. Please comment on our social media. We're on Facebook, YouTube. We've got an Instagram. We're on Rumble as well. So you can watch the show, or you can listen to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. We also want to mention the Ministry League. We're part of the Ministry League Network, and they are a fantastic group to work with. Um, Please download the Ministry League app. It's a fantastic resource for Christians. It's got a songbook. It's got other fantastic podcasts. It's got plenty of Christian resources. So much. You're going to spend a lot of time on that app. Also, there is the Bearing Up shop. We have apparel and mugs and all kinds of things that you can purchase to help support us in our work. All 100% of the funds that are raised by that go into this work and making it easier for other people to see and to participate in this work. So please check us out there, and we've got some really neat things for you to check out. So just a reminder to keep all these things in mind, and let's get back to it. So, depending on where you are in your life at this point in time, it may feel like circumstances are unfair, or may seem like circumstances are limiting. Yes, we could go into the whole political aspect, and we can talk about current events and what people think about, um, you know, their circumstances and situation, and the victimhood, and all of that stuff. Um, but maybe there's just some things that have happened to you, a particular trial, and it just seems unfair. It seems limiting. It seems like there's got to be somebody to blame for my circumstances. What do we need to do when it feels that way?
Um, well, I think about all of the things that I personally complain about. I don't I don't find myself complaining about things that I do or things that I can control. I always complain about things that I really have no control over, um, things that other people do. And um, And for me, I have to remind myself, number one, complaining is not going to do any good. Um, it just it usually does not help the situation. It usually hurts. Whether either I have a problem with someone and I'm complaining directly to them, and telling them how they're terrible, horrible, no good, human beings, for doing this, or I'm complaining to someone else about them, which is not good either. Which um, it's not good for me to put down people or situations, um, to somebody else and to unload on them. Um, I will say that in my mind, there's a difference between complaining and what's the word? Healthily. Is healthily a word? Healthily, the most healthy.
Healthily.
Yeah, there is
Yeah.
a healthy way. There is a healthy way of verbally, you know, putting out frustrations, because I know that some people, for them to process what they're thinking, they have to
Yeah.
literally verbalize it. They have to talk about it. Um,
Right.
but there is a healthy way to go about that. Um,
Yeah.
Instead of just,
There's right. We might call it venting,
mhm,
right? And there's this idea that you know we let others in, right? We let others in with our concerns, and we talk about things uh, for the purpose, right? There's a purpose behind it. For the purpose of processing our situation, looking for solutions. It's not for the sake of it's not complaining for the sake of complaining. It's working out your situation with others so that you can process it, so that you can uh you know overcome those things, and you can pray together with individuals and things like that. um I agree with you there.
yeah, and in my mind, the number one thing is realizing that this complaint is coming from a frustration or something that I can't control, and um, and Jesus says it here in verse 3, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Uh, maybe someone has done something to us that is not good, and we have no control over that, or we've been put in a situation like this man. He's been blind from birth, and he has no control over that.
Yeah.
But realizing that
um
everything works for the good.
there's a passage I like to read, and it may be a familiar one. um but in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14, um there is the command, do all things without grumbling or disputing. And that's all well and fine to just look at that verse and say, oh, well, it's commanded, so we shouldn't do it. But if you look at the context of this, you've got um, a so that in the next verse, so that you'll prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. So I think the complaining aspect or disputing or arguing, they kind of go hand in hand, because a lot of the times when you complain or you think you're treated unfairly or unjustly, it can be divisive. You know, especially like if we talk about victimhood. Well, if I'm a victim of something, then somebody is the victimizer, or some there's a situation that I'm in, and that is the victimizer, right? If I feel like I'm treated unfairly, then somebody is to blame, right? And it could be God. Blame God. You can blame the people that are around you, other things like that. You can blame the circumstances and set yourself up as an enemy to your own circumstances, right? There's a division in your own circumstances, and you despise your life, and you despise your circumstances, and you get angry, and you hold this in your heart, and it's like, ugh. But but we're not to complain or dispute or to argue or to grumble, uh, because it shows what is working on the inside. He says, don't do this so that you will prove yourselves as innocent children, innocent and blameless children of God, so that you appear as lights in the world. So it's kind of like this little light of mine we find from like Matthew chapter 5.
Mm-hmm.
We don't hide it, right? We don't cover it up. When we grumble and complain, that's the bushel that we put over the light sometimes. And it can be that way. Um, but the grander context of this is to have the mind of Christ. Have the mind of Christ. Let the attitude of Christ be in you. He talks about Christ and who he is and what he did, and he left heaven and was obedient even to the point of the death on the cross, and now he stands exalted. And if you're going to have the mind of Christ, then you don't need to be complaining and grumbling. And it doesn't show you as a pure individual that's holding fast to the word of life. Verse 16. So that's something that we need to avoid because it's not the mind of Christ. But there are things that we can develop that help us with our attitude when it comes to our circumstances. And we can dissect these kinds of things. We can talk about faith and trust and dependence in the Lord, the courage to trust the Lord. And I think that particularly in our circumstances, trusting God and depending on God are central. I really think that they are. They are central to our attitude about where we are and what we're facing and whatever it is. Because if we trust and depend on God, what sort of outlook do we have on our circumstances?
Well, I think about realizing that that even the things that we can't control, that we have no power to control, God controls all of that.
Yeah.
And He knows what He's doing with our lives. So, and going back to what you said about Jesus, I think about of all the people that reserve the right to complain, whether it was with His 12 apostles, unifying them, or His moments on the cross. Of all the people that held the reserve, had the right to complain, it was God in human form with us, but yet He chose not to.
Yeah. I mean, he trusted in the plan. He trusted that his circumstances were a part of, there was a grander scheme around them. And that's a huge part of this too, is recognizing that, yeah, not everything is good. Not everything is inherently good. But Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So understanding that, why would we complain about our circumstances at all if we understand that there's a grander scheme behind it? Now, we've talked about several different individuals, the circumstances that they were in. But what did they all have in common, which they did when they were approached by the Lord? Or when they were approached in those circumstances and, they were at kind of a crossroads, perhaps. They all had to make the decision to answer the call, right? Even after Moses and Gideon, they made their excuses and wanted proof and, all that other stuff. They went. They listened and they obeyed. right? The disciples, they turned and they obeyed. David, he had faith and pursued, um, this fight because he knew that God was going to be the victor. So he went. He did something, right? And even the blind man, if we go back and we look at the passage that we began with in John chapter 9, and I'm going to read this time, if you don't mind. But picking up in verse 6, the New American Standard Bible says, when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his hands and said to him, right? Jesus tells the blind man to do something. Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went away and washed and came back seeing. So, would the blind man have come back seeing if he didn't go to the pool? Absolutely not. Right? He could have just said, well, God's going to pull me out of this circumstance, but I don't have to do anything. He listened and he obeyed and he had faith, right? Why did he go? He had faith that it would happen, right? He listened to Jesus and he went because he believed that what he said was true, that if he went, then he would be healed. So he went to Siloam and he washed and then he came back seeing, this man who had never seen before in his entire life. God used all of these people in their circumstances and their weakness to do his work. And God is able to do that in our lives no matter what our circumstances are, whether they're favorable or they're not so favorable, or we look around and we look at all the people in the world and we say, well, I'm better off than them or I'm worse off than them. We make those comparisons all the time. We're human and we look at people and we make those, but regardless of where we are, God can use us. Even in weakness, we have to answer and respond to God's call. We don't need to let the excuses, cause us to do nothing. Because none of these individuals just did nothing. Right? None of them just did nothing.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of ties it all together. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10 says, therefore I am content with weaknesses. This is Paul talking about that thorn of the flesh. I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distress, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Who is strong? Paul. Paul is strong. All right, he has strength. What is that strength needed for? I don't know. To live. To live,
things.
to go,
Yeah.
to work, to do anything, right? But where's the strength come from?
It's from God.
Yeah, it comes from God.
And I just think, this whole idea, when you're in a, this man being blind from birth, not a pun on words, but when you're in the middle of something you can't see, for him, he literally couldn't see. But for us, we can't see, Jesus' phrase, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Sometimes it's easier to complain. It's easier just to unload and say, woe is me. The hard thing is to say, hey, there's something bigger here. The hard thing is to trust and to know that God, like you said, does everything for good. So
Yeah. And that's kind of why I wanted to introduce this. I haven't talked about it too much. But as a principle, if we carry with us a John 9:3 principle, what we can take from that is my circumstances may not be anybody's fault. They might be my own fault. I might have done something. But that's not what we need to focus on. We don't need to focus on whose fault it is. We don't need to, I think we should fess up when we make mistakes. We need to ask for forgiveness. We need to try and be restorative in our relationships. All of that stuff. We need to bear the blame for our mistakes. Certainly. But we don't need to look at our circumstances and say, woe is me. Instead, when we find ourselves in a difficult place, we should say to ourselves, maybe I'm here so that God can do His work in me. Maybe I'm in this situation, or maybe I experience this weakness so that God is going to work in me in this. And again, if we believe in that promise of Romans 8:28, and I love it, and I talk about it all the time. If we believe in that promise as Christians, then there's nothing in our lives that we can say, well, this is pointless. This is pointless suffering. And woe is me. There's nothing in our lives. Never at any point should we say that. Instead, we can look hopefully forward to what God is going to bring out of the situation. Whose fault was it? Whose fault was it? Was it the man's fault? That he was born with sin, or was it the parents' fault? No, it was so that he was in these circumstances, so that God would display His works in him. And so if we take that concept and that idea and we apply it in our own lives and say, you know what? God is going to use this. He's going to use this. I'm going to get off my tail and I'm going to work for Him, and I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to try hard, and I'm not going to play the victim, but I'm going to answer the call. I'm going to live for Him. He's going to use this. I'm going to be stronger than ever. And, and I think there's a great reward for that, because if we have faith and trust God and depend on Him, and obey His word, we have the expectation and assurance of heaven. And no matter what happens in our lives, that's ahead of us. And that's the grand scheme of things, the greater picture of all of this.
Well, personally, this topic has been very good for me, because I find myself recently complaining a lot. So this has been really good for me, personally.
Yeah, it's been good for me too. I just got talking about worrying, like last Sunday, which we're recording this the day after.
Yeah.
But talking about complaining too. It's like just hit them all. Hit all the things.
Yeah.
But anyway,
All right.
we really appreciate y'all for tuning in and joining us today, and we hope that you'll stick around for just a little bit longer. Joshua's going to lead us in closing prayer and the servant spotlight. Did you have anything else you wanted to add or say?
Nope.
Okay.
Good.
We'll go ahead and do that then.
Our Lord and our God, we want to thank You for today. I'm thankful that You love us and that You take care of us. And I hope that we do better about complaining, and that we can get to a point in our lives where we are thankful for hardships, and we are thankful for trials, because they work to better us and to better Your kingdom if we allow them to. I'm thankful for Zach, and I'm thankful for everything that you do for us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, our servant spotlight today is a current blah blah blah. Yep, is a current student at Freed-Hardeman University. His name is Ethan Coy, and he is not a Bible major, but um, he has decided this summer that he wants to take an internship working for a congregation. And he said the purpose of this internship was, even though he doesn't see himself being a full-time minister, he wants to be able to help a congregation, when he graduates in whatever ways, that he can. So he said, you know what? I'm going to take this internship to learn, you know, how to be a better minister, even if that's not his full-time profession. So I think we need more people like that, that that say, you know what? I'm not going to be a full-time minister, but I want to hone my skills. That way I can be a better minister. So he is my servant spotlight today.
We thank y'all so much for watching. Have a good one.